Alright, so this is just going to be a fun little project where we actually take some checkboxes and we style them to look like these little sliders here with these little balls that we can animate back and forth. Okay, so we're going to add a little bit of CSS and we're going to style them with CSS and then add some animations to give it this effect. And then finally we're going to add a little bit of JavaScript logic, because when you have a project you rarely get it to be good, cheap, and fast. So basically if we choose good, cheap, and then we click fast, it's going to uncheck cheap. Okay, so we might get it to be good and fast, but then it's not going to be cheap. We can do cheap and fast, and we can do cheap and good, but we can't do all three because that's very rare. So it's just fun to add a little bit of logic to it. But you know, you can use these little slider widgets inside of your user interfaces and websites. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so let's get started. I just have my project starter open here, and we're going to change the title here to, let's call it good, cheap, fast. And basically we're going to have just some checkboxes, but we're going to style them to look really cool. We're going to add some animation, and we're going to add some logic so that you can't pick, for instance, all three, because it's hard to get a project that's good, cheap, and fast. It'll be either cheap and fast or cheap and good. So we'll add some logic with JavaScript later on. So let's go ahead and add here. I'm actually going to use an H2 here. So let's put an H2 and say, how do you want your project to be? And then we'll have our toggle. So we're going to have three separate divs with the class of toggle container that are going to surround the input, the label, and the text, the span text. So let's create toggle dash container, and in here let's put an input with the type of checkbox, and we don't need a name. Oops, we don't need a name for the ID. We'll say good, and let's also give it a class of toggle. Okay, so that's our input. Now we want a label, because when you have a label for a form field, you can click on that label and it will, in this case, it'll check or uncheck the checkbox. So let's say label for good. So the ID should match, the ID for the input should match the for attribute on the label. And then I'm also going to give this a class of label. And then inside the label we're going to have a class of ball. So this is going to be the, you know, the round part of the slider, whatever you want to call it, that's going to go back and forth, that we're going to animate. So we're not going to put anything in this div, we just want to have it here for styling. And then outside of the label we're going to have a span with the text. So this will say good. Okay, so we'll save that. It's not going to look very good until we add our CSS, but we want three of these. So this div of toggle container, I'm going to just grab that, let's paste that in here and here, and then just change, the second one's going to be cheap, so we'll change this, actually this ID right here, the for and this, to cheap. And I'm just going to add uppercase here. Okay, so now we have cheap, and the last one is going to be fast, so let's change this to fast and just make this uppercase, like that, and that should do it for the HTML. So pretty simple. Now the CSS is going to really change how this looks, so we have quite a bit to do here. Not too much, but we're going to do some animation. Let's start off with the body here. So we'll just stick with the Roboto font. Display flex, line items. We don't need, well, yeah, we'll keep the column. I don't think we have to change anything here, so we can just leave that. So let's start to style the toggle container. So the toggle container, I'm going to display flex, and I want to use align items here to display everything, or align to the center. I'm going to add a margin here of 10 pixels on the top and bottom, and then a width of 200 pixels. So remember, the container wraps around the input, the label, and the span text. Now the class of toggle, so we have the class of toggle, which is on the input itself, the checkbox. We don't want to show that because we're basically replacing that with the cool ball look, or whatever you want to call it, the slider, the ball, whatever. So let's grab the toggle class, and I'm going to set the visibility to hidden. So now we can't see the actual checkbox. Now we have the label, and for the label, let's give this a width. We'll give it a width of 40 or 80 pixels, and then let's give it a height of 40 pixels. Okay, so I mean, it's here, you can't see it yet, so let's give it a background color of gray. So we're going to use D0 3 times here. There we go. We want it to have really rounded corners, so I'm going to set the border radius to 50 pixels, like that. And we want to set a cursor pointer, so when we hover over it, we have a cursor. I'm going to display it as an inline block because it's inline by default, and I want to be able to add a margin of, let's do 0, 15, 0. Okay, so that'll kind of put some space around it, and that actually should do it for the label itself. Now, if it's checked, then I want the background color of the label to change. So what we can do is take the toggle, which is the checkbox, and we can say :checked, which means when it's in its check state, then we want to style the label and set the background color. I'm going to set it to hexadecimal value 8E44AD, like that. Now as soon as I do that, the first one is purple because it's checked. If I click it again, it's going to uncheck and it's going to be gray. Okay, so we can now do this. Now the next thing I want to do is the ball. We want to have that little circle inside, so we have a class of ball. And let's set the background for that to white, which we're not going to see yet because it doesn't have any content in it. It also doesn't have a height or width. So let's set the height to 34 pixels, and also the width, let's set that to 34 pixels. Okay, so you can see the white square in here. We want it to be round, so let's set border radius to 50%. Okay, and then we want to position it, so let's position this absolute, and we're actually going to want to have the label position relative because we're positioning the ball absolute within the label, so the label then has to be position relative. So let's add that here, relative. Okay, so we're going to position absolute, and then as far as where we want to put it inside the label, let's do 3 pixels from the top, and let's do 3 pixels from the left. Okay, so it fits right in there nice and snug. And let's also just align items center and justify content center as well. Okay, now when I click, you can see it just turns purple. We don't have the animation here. So what we'll do in the next video is add the animation, so when we click, it slides over, and click again, it slides back. Okay, so now we want to create the animation for the ball to move back and forth when we click it. So we're going to have 2 animations. So let's create those. We'll say keyframes. This one is going to be called slide on. And this is just going to have it go from here to here. And we're going to do that by just changing the value of the translate X axis. So we'll use transform property and set the translate X to be further over. We'll also scale it a bit. So let's go ahead and say at 0% of this animation, we want transform, and we're going to set translate X because we're moving it on the X axis, right to left, or left to right in this case. We're going to start at 0, and the scale is going to start at just 1, which is what it is by default. And then at 50%, we want to set transform to translate X and go from 0 to 20 pixels, and then set the scale to 1.2, and then at 100%, so let's say 100%, we want transform translate X, and this is going to be 40 pixels, and set scale back to 1. Okay, so that's the slide on. Now the slide off is basically just going to be this backwards. So I'm going to just copy this, and let's set this to slide off. And 0% is going to be at 40 pixels because it's going to be at the end, scale 1. And then second is going to be the same, 20 pixels. And then third, or 100% I should say, is going to be back at 0 with a scale of 1. Okay, so pretty simple animations. Now we need to implement this because we haven't added it to anything. So for the ball, let's add animation, and we want to set this to slide off, and let's say 0.3 seconds for the duration. We want it to be linear and forwards. All right, and you can see as soon as I save, since I'm using live server, it automatically reloads. It shows you that animation. Now when we click on it, we check it, we want to run slide on, right? So let's go right here, and the way we can target this with our CSS is the toggle, which is the checkbox input, when it's checked. Okay, so colon checked means in the check state. Then we want to add the label class and then the ball class. That's what we want to animate. Okay, so this is basically by default it'll have the slide off, but when it's checked it'll run slide on. So let's set animation to slide on, 0.3 seconds, linear and forwards. Okay, so we'll save that, and now since the first one is checked, you can see that it's pushed over to the side. If I reload this, they're all going to be unchecked, but now if I click that, that, and then if I click it again, it removes the checked and it runs this, which is slide off, which brings it back over because of where we're setting it on the x-axis. All right, so we have that part done. Now the only thing we have left is the logic, because we don't want to be able to say good, fast, and cheap, because that's very rare that you get that. So we'll be able to do like cheap and good or cheap and fast. So we'll add a little bit of JavaScript to this next. Okay, so in the last video we did our little animation, and right now we can put these wherever we want, but I want to make it so that if we try to do all three, it's not going to let us do good, cheap, and fast. So we want to have it so, it can do cheap and good, it can do cheap and fast, but it can't do all three. So first thing I want to do is bring in everything we need. Let's bring in the toggles, which is the checkbox themselves. So let's say document.query selector all, because there's more than one, and we want all the ones with the class of toggle. And then let's get each, basically we want to grab, the label, not the label, but the ID of good, cheap, and fast. So toggles gets all of these, but we want each individual one by its ID. So here we'll say ID good. This is going to be query selector, and let's set this to good, and then this one here is going to be cheap query selector, and let's do ID of cheap, and then this is going to be fast, so ID of fast. Make sure you use query selector since it's a single element, and fast. So we're bringing in everything we need. Now I'm going to take toggles and I'm going to loop through with a for each and say for each toggle let's add an event listener. So we'll say toggle dot add event listener, and the event is going to be a change. Okay, when you have a checkbox and you want to add an event to it, you want to use change, not click. So when that runs, we'll have a function, and we're going to have a function run called do the trick, and pass in the e.target value, which is the whatever we select, and we have to pass in here our event object. Okay, so now each time we click on one of these, it's gonna fire off the change event, and it's gonna call do the trick and pass in whatever the target is, pass in that element. So let's create a function called do the trick, and it's gonna take in, we'll call the clicked one, because that's what it is, it's the one we clicked on. And we want to check first to see if all three are checked. So we can say if good dot checked, because when you have a checkbox, you bring it into the DOM, you can access if it's checked or not with dot checked, and it'll be a true or false. So we'll say if good is checked, if cheap is checked, and if fast is checked. Okay, so if that's true, let's say if good is equal to the clicked one, so basically the clicked one, meaning the e.target that's passed in, then we're gonna say fast dot checked, and we want to uncheck it, so we're gonna set that to false. Okay, and then let's say if cheap is the clicked one. Okay, so if we click on cheap, then we'll take good, and let's set checked and set that to false. And then if we have fast that's clicked, then we want to set cheap checked to false. All right, so let's save that. Now if I go and I check good, cheap, and then I click fast, you'll see cheap will automatically slide back over because it's set back to false right here. Okay, if I click cheap, then good is going to be unchecked. If I click good, fast is going to be unchecked. Okay, if cheap is already selected. We can do good and not cheap and not fast. We can do fast, not cheap, not good. We can do cheap and fast or good, but we can't do all three, or it's very rare at least. So it's just a fun little project, and you could use these nice sliders, these styled checkboxes in your UI. The logic here was just really for fun, but that's it. Let's go ahead and get started on the next one.